family of God. Is that right? Because I used to be a Zionist. I used to work in construction camps in Australia. And after the Six-Day War in 1967, I was raving at this construction camp in the desert, showing how the Israelis have had this great victory and how brave they were. And this Muslim stood up and said, "Kiwi," that's a nickname for New Zealanders, he said, "You make me sick." I go, "What?" "Well, you don't know what you're talking about." "What do you mean? Where did you get your information from?" "From Time magazine." Of course, everybody laughed. We're indoctrinated by Time magazine and all the media today, which is not interested in conditioning or preaching the truth to you or revealing the truth to you. They limit that where they can. They're only interested in conditioning you into seeing the alternative for the problems in the world as a new world order. And you're well aware of a new world order, and there's two powers that are spoken of in the new world order, and then they're in the book of Revelation. What are those two powers? There's one that received the wound, the deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after it. Sister White said in Great Controversy 581 that Rome lost her ascendancy. Does anybody know when Rome lost its ascendancy? 1798. Who did Rome lose its ascendancy to? Because I've heard misinformed Adventist preachers standing up and saying that Rome beat itself up in 1798. Sister White makes it clear that it was destroyed by the beast from the bottomless pit. And it's mentioned in Revelation chapter 11, verse 7 and on, that the beast from the bottomless pit destroyed the old order of the union of church and state. Do we know that the church and state united for 1260 years? Are we aware of that? When did that union start? 538 AD. We're going to have to express this one day in court when we're all on our own. But we won't be alone because God will be with us through the Word. And if we've not been watching the Muppet Show on TV, Miss Piggy and that, and we've been reading our Bible, then the Holy Spirit can remind us of those words, and He does. And we find that we're witnessing on the street. And you must find that yourself. You want to...
Ask a question?
Yeah, please do.
You were talking about that New World Order, and I was looking at that. There is an educational system called Common Core Education run by the United Nations. And there, one of the first schools here is here in Arlington, Texas. And it is geared to students in high school are geared to become international. One Earth, one system in opposition to each other. All right, point number two. The trail of the Jesuits.
Yes?
Everywhere I'm saying that. The trail of the Jesuits is here, it's there, it's in the church, it's in every system. How much truth is that?
Well, this is where I differ with some Adventist commentators, and I don't know everything, God forbid, but I do know one thing. You cannot look at Earth's history without seeing a Jewish content. And when Rome fell, when the union of church and state, the old order, fell in 1798, it was assisted by the secret societies and the Freemasons, which were controlled by the international financiers who were all Jews. The Mendelssohns, the Breech Schroders, the Rothschilds, and all that. They financed the revolution because they hated Catholicism, because Catholicism, with the union of the state, had evicted them from Spain in 1492, that evicted them from every country in the world the Jews were evicted from. So they got their revenge. And one note of this is the Freemasonry is only the resurrected Knights Templar. And I don't know whether I spoke about this last time, but the resurrected Knights Templar were the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry when the church and state destroyed the Knights Templar in 1307. But the heads of the Knights Templar were Gnostic Jews. All the spear fodder or the armies were Roman Catholics on the lower rungs of the society. And they were promised that if they went to the Middle East to get the temple site back, Jesus would forgive them all their sins. Do you follow me? So they chopped off people's head and murdered and that in the name of Christ, and they thought that they'd be freed on the judgment day for the amount of atrocities they committed. And so when they got back from the Middle East, they failed to rebuild the temple, and there's been, I'm not going to bore you tonight, but I do have slide presentations showing the dozens of attempts that the Jews, through the influence of money, have tried to rebuild the temple. From one of the first, well, I won't go into deeps, but they're not going to rebuild their temple. All of deceived Sunday-keeping Christianity today believe they're going to rebuild the temple. But I know that God's not going to be made a liar out of. When he destroyed the temple in AD 70, there was a reason for it. The Jews had rejected him, Jesus Christ, God's dear Son, as their Saviour, and said, let his blood be on us and our children. Is that true? And that is echoed down the ages as a great tragedy upon the Jews. And anyway, I'll keep it brief, but when the Knights Templar were destroyed in AD 1307 AD, on the Friday the 13th, I think it was of September, some of them went underground, some went to Portugal, some actually they believed they had a colony in Virginia. Have you read about that? Long before the so-called finding of America by Columbus, which suits the Catholic Church for their right to claim here. We won't go down that line today, but it's an interesting topic to discuss amongst ourselves sometime. But some of them went to Scotland. And
Scotland's the point that proves the American connection in that chapel.
Yeah, at Roslyn.
Roslyn.
Yeah, and the Masonic signs throughout it.
And all the Rosicrucians.
Yeah, the Rosicrucians. Well, they resurrected as the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry was the resurrection of the Knights Templar. Now, what was the goal of the Knights Templar? To rebuild the temple. Why? Because the Jewish influence, what is their goal? They believe they're the chosen people of God. They don't take into consideration why they were dispersed around the world, and they do not take into consideration why their temple was destroyed. There was a reason for it, because God rejected them, because they rejected the only chance they ever had, which was Jesus Christ. And so we're the chosen people of God. And I can tell you, if you look at Luke chapter 2, is at 33, there was a prophet in Israel back then. And what was his name? He held up baby Jesus on the 8th day. Simeon. And this destroys the myth that the Sunday-keeping churches today believe that the people in the Middle East are God's chosen people, right? They can say that, but they're not. And the reason they're not, one of the to prove this case, when Simeon held up baby Jesus, he said something. He said, this child shall cause the what? The rise and the fall of many in Israel. Which were the ones that, through Jesus, as the fulcrum, which are the ones that fell? All the unbelieving Jews. Which were the ones that rose? The Jews that believed in Jesus Christ, the greatest Jew that ever walked the earth. And then it says, so the church was Israel. That's the point I'm making. And Simeon brings that out in Luke 2:33. Do you follow me? Then you go to Galatians 3:29, and it says, I'm going to have to stop and get onto this soon, but I want to make a point, since we started, that Galatians 3:29 says, if you be Christ, then you are a what? Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And 85% of those in Israel today are Ashkenazim Jews. Does anybody know anything about the Ashkenazim Jews? You don't? They have no, you know? Who said yes? They have no racial connection with any of the tribes of Israel. They're of the seed of Esau, and they were converted by rabbis that came up out of Babylon in the 8th century AD. And these Khazars, as they were called, from the steppes of Russia or in southern Ukraine, in Sevastopol, around the Black Sea in the Crimea, their king, Bulin, was converted to the Jewish faith by these two rabbis, and he ordered the whole lot of them to become Jews. So their language, which they had no written language, their language is Yiddish, and it was written down using the Hebrew alphabet. And in the 13th century, well, Christ said to the unbelieving Jews, you compass the world to make one proselyte, and what? You make him what? 2 times more the child of hell that you are. And so there's conditions on the grace of God, and that's our obedience. So then what happened? When the Catholic Church was destroyed in 1798? First of all, they took the King of France's head off in 1793 after the 1789 revolution. I've got DVDs out there, but I can't sell them to you tonight because it's the Sabbath. After Sabbath tomorrow, you can have a look at them if you wish. But they had a vendetta against the Knights Templar being destroyed by what? What destroyed them? The union of church and state. So that the Pope Clement V united with Philip the Fair or Philip IV of France to destroy the Knights Templar. So when they came up out of Scotland and re-emerged in the early 1700s in France, they went after the Catholic Church. And they knew to destroy the Catholic Church, and incidentally, their control over the Gentiles, or our ancestors if we came from Europe, was through Freemasonry. So what was the goal of Freemasonry at the head? To rebuild the temple. And so they knew that if they would destroy the Catholic Church, they had to take out the Jesuits, the secret police of the Catholic Church. And in 1773, they succeeded in that by talking all the kings of Europe into doing that. How did the kings of Europe comply, or why? Because they had them all in debt with their money. The Jewish money power goes back to Babylon. I've got evidence in my slide presentations in a book I'm writing that they controlled the money of Babylon. And why do you think Xerxes, or the Persian king, gave the decree for the rebuilding of Jerusalem? Money? Yeah. Do you know what they did? The Jewish influence through money in Babylon, the Jews, I believe, and there's evidence from it, they left the gates open for the Persians and the Medes to come in. So they would deserve a favour, didn't they? It wasn't the kindness of the Persians, there was payback time because they left the gates open of Babylon, and the old Belshazzar had their throat cut, and all the kings and princes. So this money power goes back a long way, and you cannot look at church history without taking that or world history without taking that into account. And so, who's heard of Albert Pike? Albert Pike? Do you know where Albert Pike lived? He died in 1890, but Albert Pike, his real name was Albert Chase. He was an Ashkenazim Jew. He was the head of World Freemasonry, and he wrote a book called Morals, Dogma. And I miraculously got a copy of that. On page 824, 823, it says this: when the head of Louis XVI fell from the guillotine into the basket, half our work was done. That was 1793. What did he mean by half our work was done? What was the other half? The church. They knocked the kings off, the old order, and then they knocked the church off when they took Pope Pius VI captive in 1798. And it was done by the beast from the bottomless pit. Now, we're going to get on with our slide presentation, but Napoleon, does anybody know where Napoleon was in 1798 at the time of the end? Where? He was in Egypt. What was Napoleon doing? Has anybody seen? You look on the computer when you go home, you'll see pictures of Napoleon like this. What does that mean? Scratching? Yes, that's not a bad observation, but you're only partly right. He was a Freemason. You see, and that's one of the Masonic signs. So if you're a Mason and I'm a Mason, we can recognise each other. Do you follow me? And so we can help each other out. Well, we as Christian, we believe we have to help everybody out, not just a few brothers. And so, why was Napoleon in Egypt? He was a Freemason. What is the goal of Freemasonry? To retake the temple. I've got evidence on my slides up there that shows that he wrote a letter to the French government or directorate which said, "Gentlemen, by the time you get this letter, I hope to be standing on Solomon's temple site." So it was payback time to all the Jewish bankers who had financed the downfall of the church and the king, the old order. And then through the 19th century, in many respects, we owe part of our freedoms to Freemasonry that hated the Catholic Church and kept it at bay. But the Jesuits now, that's another story, and we're going to move on now, but talking about the Jesuits, they've been taken over. So I hear a lot of Adventists going on about the Jesuits, and the Jesuits. and the Jesuits do play a major part, but they are subservient to a greater power. Does anybody know who that greater power is? They're subservient to the power that's mentioned in Revelation 17 and 18 as the habitation of devils. Have you read that, where the Catholic Church would become the habitation of devils? Have you read where, and you only have to look at conservative Catholic websites to find out, they know what's gone on in the Catholic Church. The Freemasons took over the Catholic Church. That means the Jews took it over. And I said to a prominent Jewish friend of mine, why would they do that? He grinned at me and said, the best way to control your enemy is from the inside. Do you follow me? And so that is why the Jesuits have changed. And I have got a Jesuit friend up in Washington. He's gone a bit senile now, but I visited him half a dozen times, and he was quite honest with me. Now, this all happened at Vatican II. You can find it on the internet. The Roman Catholic Church, well, when Pius XII died, does anybody remember he was a Nazi pope? Before that, in 1939, a pope was poisoned. His name was Pius XI. Now, all this is history. And on July, I think it was July the 10th, he was going to announce the condemnation of Hitler and Mussolini, because they were standing up against the Masonic communism. The first Supreme Soviet in Russia in 1917 had 50 out of the 59 members, 56 of them were Jews under assumed names, right? So it was their payback, and they killed, I made a statement last time I was in America, that they killed 40 million Russians. And this man said, excuse me, sir, if you do your homework, you'll find there were 60 million Russians. They killed and killed and killed. And of course, because the Jews own the Western media, we're not told about these things. You've got to find them out behind the bicycle sheds, and you feel guilty for for finding these things out. And the moment you try and expose it or tell anybody about it, you're considered to be an anti-Semite, right? And as Voltaire once said, if you want to know who's controlling the world, this was 200 years ago, if you want to know who's controlling the world, find out who you're not allowed to criticise. That's a good indication, do you follow me? If you want to know who's controlling the world. And so the goal of, and I'll bring this to a head, but the goal of Freemasonry and the Jews is to restore them to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Now we know as Adventists they're not going to rebuild the temple, but that's their goal. And in their arrogance and ignorance they cannot see that there's a greater hand preventing them from doing that. Because it says, is it in Luke 21:22, that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And that's not 1967, as some Adventist commentators said. It's the end of close of probation. Do you follow me? And so God said, not one stone will be left upon another. And so the temple is not going to be rebuilt, but the devil is not, while he's using the Jews and giving them the fabulous wealth of the world, and he's used the Catholic Church, he can spit on his so-called friends whenever he likes to make himself look wonderful. Do you follow what I mean? And his main goal, Sister White said, is at 9T28, Satan will use secret societies in order to prepare the world for his coming. We as a people know that Satan is going to come as a great angel of light. Do you follow me? And so I believe all they're going to do in the Middle East is create a nuclear war. It's coming, friends. You can see we're on the very tiptoes of eternity. And so when we have the Jews trying to take over the temple site, Russia comes in. Do you know China's come in to help them now? So all these Sunday-keeping churches are looking at Ezekiel 38:9 that said, there's Gog and Magog, right? Gog and Magog are there. We're going to have the temple rebuilt. The Antichrist is going to come. I believe it's going to end in a great nuclear war. And who's going to come in the midst of it and save us? You read Great Controversy 6:26, 6:24 and 5. Jesus is going to come and save us. Amen. And he's going to tell us to keep Sunday holy. Well, look at the logic. If he comes tonight, or there's a big Rose Bowl football final, and everybody's eating popcorn and drinking Coke or beer and watching the ball game, and one of the kids says, "Hey Dad, there's a bright angel outside." He said, "Be quiet, the seagull, the whatever, they just scored a goal." Oh, you follow me? No one's going to go outside to see him. But if he comes after a nuclear war, or in the midst of the nuclear war, which he's caused with this hand, and he's going to stop it with this hand and tell people to love each other, be kind and gentle and sweet, and to keep Sunday holy in honor of his resurrection. And then we're going to stand and say, "No, you're a deceiver." What? He stopped this war, and the Sunday keepers are going to point at us, and then he's going to say, "You must get rid of this. These problems and earthquakes in the world will continue to cease, and God is most upset these people not showing me respect. So you've got to get rid of them." See, and remember, all the great problems in the world were caused by men who thought they were right, trying to force others to be right. But back very quickly to Pius XI, who died mysteriously on the 8th of July, I think it was, 1939, 2 days before he was to condemn Hitler and Mussolini, who were standing up against this great onslaught of paganism and socialism, communism, which had the audacity to separate church from state. The old stability, the old stable system where the church controlled us because of the doctrine of original sin. From the cradle to the grave, you needed the church and you needed the priest to give you the last rites. Do you follow me? We're at the Protestant Reformation. God set us free. He set us free, and each individual had to make up their own minds, work out your own salvation. Do you see where I'm coming from? Now the Jesuits are turning the wonderful liberties of America into licentiousness, until the logic conclusion is we could elect Trump because the pendulum is coming back and people are saying we need some law and order. We need to get back to the basics of Christianity. Now, I don't know, I'm not a prophet, but it's that sort of climate that is going to bring in a Sunday law. Do you follow me? As America is pricked by the principles of the separation of church and state, where our liberties are turned into licentiousness, to the extent that very soon you'll be able to marry your dog. You know, and people are getting sick of it. I'm meeting decent-minded Americans are out and they're saying, "We've had enough of it." What do? Someone stands up and says, "Let's get back to Jesus. Let's follow Jesus." Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is it? But you don't do it through the state. As one of your founders, was it Franklin, said, if a man is a law-abiding citizen, his religion is his own business. We're only accountable to God in businesses. But this is the climate where the church can get credibility, and even if it had the truth, we don't want to legislate our Sabbath on others, do we? We want to tell them about it. We were in a restaurant last night and we spoke to the cook, and we're going to give him a book. He hadn't heard that the commandments have been changed, and I was in T-Mobile today getting a phone, and Dave was the guy's name. He hadn't heard about it, but his dad is a preacher, so he's reading, thanks to Vita down there from Tonga. He had some ammunition. He had some Sunday law books. So we've got to carry, incidentally, something with us for these things. Do you follow me? And so you'd have never heard of a man by the name of Lodowchowski. Lodowchowski was the head of the Jesuits from 1915 to 1942. And he wrote numerous articles on the Jewish peril, the Jewish money power. So the Jesuits were fighting against that money power. And here was the Pope, 11, going easy on them, so they poisoned Pope Pius XI. Got poisoned 2 days, and Lodowchowski was obviously the one that had him poisoned, because the Jesuits hated these things. And so at Vatican II, does anybody know who the Pope was that was elected after Pius XII, who was a Nazi Pope? When he died in 1958. Does anybody know what the Pope was that was elected after him? I guarantee you're wrong. Pope what? John the 23rd. Everybody tells me that, or some of the ones that have read history, but it's not true. There was a Pope by the name of Cardinal Siri, S-I-R-I, was elected Pope. He was another Nazi conservative Pope. But just like there's opposition and two parties in the Adventist Church, there was two parties in the Roman Catholic Church. And the liberals were always Jewish, Freemasons or Illuminists, and they had a lot of blackmail on Cardinal Siri, and the white smoke went up the chimney, and everybody said, great, great, we've got a new Pope. But then they put the black smoke up, and everybody thought, well, what's going on? The infighting started, and the liberals had the conservative Cardinal Siri blackmailed. And do you know who got all the information? A young Jesuit priest of the time by Malachi Martin. He got all the information. And so he had to step down, and they put John the 23rd, who was a Jew. And the first thing he did was stop the Catholics' position on the anti-Jewish situation that it was that the Jews called the blood of Jesus on them and their children. And so immediately they started changing Catholic doctrine. That's why they're called Vatican II. And I'm not going to tell you any more about that, but there's quite a lot of interesting stories. You look up some of the Catholic conservative websites and you'll see what's going on. And so today, in Revelation 17, the woman rides the beast from the bottomless pit. So I'm saying these two antagonizing powers have been joined together. But just on another point, before we get into this interesting slide presentation, have you ever wondered why we always have an enemy? Shortly after every war, we spill the blood of our sons. Have you ever thought? See, the Second World War, we only go back to then, 70 years ago. We had the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and part of France. And Russia, our comrades, the Russians, were all fighting against the bad guys, the Germans. Do you follow me? They were the bad guys because they were boiling up babies and making soap out of them, right? Well, I know enough Germans to know that that was nonsense, but it was the propaganda that was used to stir up hatred. Do you follow me? And it stirred up hatred enough that all the young men of England signed up in the First World War, and they all got blown away with machine guns. But they'd made the problem that they signed up under that emotional business. Do you follow me? They signed up to go to war, and then they were all machine gunned down, 60,000 them one morning on the Somme. And there's a power. You want to look on the internet at a book written by Henry Ford. Has anyone heard of Henry Ford? He's quite a famous American. Well, you see, he wrote a book called The International Jew because the Jews tried to take him over and close him down during the Depression. Why? Because one of Karl Marx's 10 points to socialise the West was a central bank of issuance in every nation. Why? Because you get a central bank, then you expand credit like they did in the 1920s till the roaring 20s, where everybody and his dog can get an overdraft, a loan, and money was cheap and everybody had a boom. But then, what happens during the boom? People knock on the door of the bank and say, hey, I can't keep up. I'm making bicycles and I can't keep up. I need a loan. Okay, we can give you £100,000, Mr. Smith, but we have to take your factory for security. So during the boom, everybody's factories goes into hock to the banks as security for their loans. Do you follow me? So the fish is on the hook. You get it? Then in 1929, they bring the whole thing down and all the Jews take all the profit. They tried to do that to Henry Ford, but he beat them. And Henry Ford was a great American because he gave people a way to get around the countryside. Do you follow me? But all the people on Wall Street just created money out of thin air. So Henry Ford wrote a book called The International Jew. If any of you can look at it if you're interested and have a look at Henry Ford because he fought against this power for a long, long time. And so, back to Germany. This is the point I want to make. We had all these allied powers and our good guys fighting against the Germans. And the bankers were financing all sides. Do you know why? The Illuminati principle is, out of chaos comes order. We must have a depression to sell us a remedy which tightens the rope around our neck. We must have a war where all of Eastern Europe goes to the communists while we had the atom bomb, and we get the IMF, the United Nations, and the Bank of International Settlement. And we then, through political correctness, they put us under a mental dictatorship. We are not allowed to say anything which contradicts what the United Nations have passed. Do you see? That's how they're taking our autonomy off us. And so why was it, I asked this at high school, and you might have asked the same question. How come we beat the bad guys up, the Germans, and then they become our friends, and the Russians, our comrades, become our enemies? Do you follow me? You don't have to think very long and deep to see it's phony. The whole thing's phony, because we always have an enemy. And that is why they brought down, the powers that erected the Berlin Wall actually brought it down in 1989. You know, there was various reasons, but one of the reasons was, and it hasn't worked out quite for them, but it was to bring down the Berlin Wall and unite Orthodox Russia with Catholicism and Protestantism in the West against the final enemy. And who would be the final enemy? The Muslim world. The Muslims are the final enemy. Do you follow me? And Albert Pike said, in order for us to take the world for Lucifer, or to prepare the world, we must have 3 world wars. He said that in 1870. Now we've had 2, right? Then he goes on and tells us when the 3rd world war is going to come. It's going to be, he said, in 1980 or 1870, it's going to be between the Muslims and the Jews in the Middle East. And friends, we're on the tiptoes of Earth's history, and we're worrying about making too much money or paying our bills. God can look after those things. We're going to have to follow the blueprint. And we're told to get out of the cities. Get a bit of land with a bit of water in it. And if we don't do that, we may very well sell our birthright for a pottage, as Esau did. Do you follow me? Now, I don't know whether it's 8:30. Do you want me to continue on the line we're doing, and we could show this tomorrow afternoon? What do you want to do? This is going to take us 2 hours. I was going to show you something. What time do you want to finish tomorrow afternoon? Okay, well, we can show the 2 of them tomorrow afternoon. How's that? And you'll want to close tonight in half an hour at 9 o'clock. I could do the prelim of this. But any questions about what we're talking about? Some people are horrified that I've mentioned some of these things. And say so if you are.
This issue of the Jews, through the seed of Abraham, those that follow Christ become spiritual Jews. So the clash between the physical Jews, which was the real Jew, and the spiritual Jew, this conflict. So you're saying that the Roman Catholic Jesuit is also used, that group of